Hello, I'm Dora Costa. I'm the chair of the economics department. I'd like to welcome everyone to our Masters of Applied Economics Distinguished Speaker Series. We're very honored to be able to have Greg Ip, Aaron Tornell, who's the director of the MAE program, will now introduce Greg.
Welcome today. So as an economics professor, sometimes students come to ask me, Professor, can you recommend me a few books, economics books? Well, always in my list of books is one by the title of Foolproof, and the author is Greg Ip. Well, in a nutshell, this book explains why safety can be dangerous and how danger makes us safe. So, what does this mean? Some policies, they can be stabilization policies, make people feel safe, and the feeling of safety allows danger to return, often hidden from view. At the end of the day, we end up worse off. So this very nice book I highly recommend, and it explains not only why we see a lot of wildfires, but also a lot of very big financial crises. Greg Ip is the chief economics commentator at the Wall Street Journal. I'm sure many of us read the weekly column of Greg called Capital Account at the Wall Street Journal. Before the Wall Street Journal, Greg Ip was the US economics editor for The Economist, which many of us also read. Greg is a regular commentator at CNBC, National Public Radio, and PBS. Moreover, Greg shared the Pulitzer Prize for coverage of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. So without further ado, let's welcome Greg Ip.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Really appreciate the introduction. The reason Aaron likes Foolproof is that I quote him in it, in his research. So go out and buy a copy now, because Aaron told me there's going to be a question about it on the next exam. No, seriously, Aaron, when he invited me to come and speak to you, he said, just pick any topic you want. Now, this was a couple months ago, so the problem is you always have to pick the topic that you think is interesting then. Now, if I was actually picking the topic today, I think I'd probably talk about socialism, because last night the president brought it up in his State of the Union speech, and he said, well, there's creeping socialism, talk of socialism in this country, but we resolved tonight never to be a socialist country. I wrote a column in today's Wall Street Journal saying Hugo Chavez is spinning in his grave, because he's saying, you guys have no idea what socialism is. Let me show you socialism. And I thought, darn if I was. So Aaron and I had a nice argument over coffee just 30 minutes ago about what socialism is. We agreed to disagree. Luckily, I'm not taking an exam, so you'll have to know what he thinks. But as I was coming over here, it occurred to me that I actually am giving a speech about socialism, because, of course, when you think of a socialist economies, you think of the Venezuela disaster, but China is still very much a socialist economy. It calls itself a socialist market economy, but most of the economy is still state-run, and it's still an autocratic, some would say totalitarian society. And I think the reason I chose this topic was because I think that well, look, the U.S. and China have been kind of like obsessed with each other for 2 centuries now, oscillating between friendship, adoration, antagonism, and revulsion, but never indifference. So the fact that we're stuck in this period right now where President Xi Jinping of China and President Trump of the United States are trying to work out some deal to avoid massive trade war, in some sense it feels like business as usual. This is always happening, these types of tensions. But it's not business as usual. The next 2 years, in my view, will be pivotal for both these countries and the world at large. They'll determine whether this one sort of autocratic state capitalist society can coexist with a free market democratic society in the same global economic system, or if they cannot. And if they split up, do they end up on the opposite sides of a new Cold War? And what does that world look like? Now, you'll notice the name of this talk is A New Cold War ? Now, a little bit of inside gossip about journalism. Editors hate question mark headlines. They always ask you, for crying out loud, make up your mind, understand your subject well enough that you can actually give us a conclusion. Readers hate being asked to decide, okay? So I feel bad about this, about the fact that there's a question mark in this headline, but after, over a year of studying this question intensively, I still don't, I feel like I have no choice. There are too many unknowns. So I'm not going to give you a definitive answer to this question tonight, but I will try and tell you what are the forces that got us here, what paths could these countries take, and what are the implications. And so how did we get here? Historians and journalists alike, we love historic analogies because they're the best way of trying to frame current events. But the China-US relationship doesn't have any good analogs. So think about the Soviet Union and the US, the original Cold War. They were geopolitical rivals from 1945 until 1991, and yet they existed in separate economic worlds. The USSR and its communist satellites were more or less hermetically sealed from the rest of the world. And in fact, the entire world was sort of divided up into these basically self-contained economies. India and Latin America, they were pursuing autarkic policies that limited their interaction with the world. To the extent that globalization existed, it was only between North America, Australia, Western Europe, and Japan. As for China, it was certainly a geopolitical force to be reckoned with. It had nuclear weapons, but economically it was a pipsqueak. That all began to change 40 years ago with what was known as the Third Plenum of the 11th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping initiated what became known as reform and opening up. I'll spare you all the details, but suffice to say that what followed was the most spectacular growth spurt in the history of the world for any major country. China went from 2% of the world's gross domestic product to more than 10%. It is now the world's largest exporter. Compare the role of China in the economy today to the Soviet Union in the 1980s. If you look at this chart on the left, I basically looked at the Soviet Union's share of trade. It was about 5% of world trade. It was actually half of that if you exclude Eastern Europe. It was about 1% of trade with the US. It was about 3% with West Germany. It was about 1% with Japan. Now compare those numbers for China today. As you can see, there's no comparison at all. China is basically 4 times more important as a trading partner than the Soviet Union ever was. China does still have some capital controls, but even financially it is much more integrated with the global capital market than almost any country was back in the 50s and the 60s. Bottom line is China's economy is China's influence on the world economy is second only to that of the United States. Nowadays, if you're following the stock market, you'll find that a lot of days it rises or falls depending on the news out of China or the news about the China-US trading relationship. So going back to the question of analogies, well, the US has certainly had economic rivals before, and the one that people think of most often in the context of China is Japan. A lot of the accusations and fears that were directed at China today were directed at Japan in the 1970s and 1980s. It had persistent trade surpluses. Its domestic market was impenetrable to American companies. Companies like IBM had to share their technology with the Japanese competitors to do business there. Big Japanese companies and the Japanese government seem to have a symbiotic relationship. But that economic rivalry with Japan never extended to the geopolitical arena. Japan was and remains a military ally. It is a multi-party democracy, albeit one in which one party wins most of the elections. An independent judiciary, free media, transparent governance. The Japanese military never stole secrets from the American government or American companies and then shared them with Japanese companies. So you're dealing with an economic situation, you're dealing with China's economic and geopolitical challenge to the United States is more or less unprecedented in modern history. So let's talk a little bit about what effect China had on economically, what China's entry into the global economy had. The crowning achievement of reform and opening it up was its entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. This was a shock to the global economy whose repercussions are still being felt. Arguably, the U.S., as the largest and most open major trading partner of China, felt the shock the most. The U.S., as the largest and most open trading partner of China, felt the shock the most. Western companies began moving huge amounts of manufacturing capacity to China. When Tim Cook arrived at Apple from Compaq in the late 1990s to take over operations, one of his most important steps was to consolidate the assembly of all of its products in China. Apple's last American factory closed in 2004. There's one widely quoted study that estimates 1 million jobs were lost directly to trade with China in the 2000s. You can double that number if collateral effects are included. So everybody knows, and hopefully everybody taking the program here knows, that trade creates winners and losers, all right? The theory says that Americans would lose jobs where China had the comparative advantage, and they would gain jobs where the United States had the comparative advantage. Well, in the context of trade with China, we got the first. We lost a lot of jobs to Chinese imports, but we didn't get the second. We didn't gain a lot of jobs by selling to China. And why not? Because China pursued a policy of what we call mercantilism, which basically means you deliberately suppress your imports, you promote your exports because the goal is to run very large trade surpluses. How did it do this? It did this with tariffs, with non-tariff barriers, and most important, by holding the exchange rate artificially low. Now, maybe Adam Smith discredited the idea of mercantilism 2 centuries ago, but apparently nobody told the Chinese. So you had this direct economic effect of China's entry into the WTO. And by the way, an effect that was mostly felt in the United States, but felt in other countries as well, such as Mexico. But it wasn't just this that was kind of a shock. It was also that a lot of the other ancillary positive effects of WTO membership didn't materialize. For example, we thought that when China joined the WTO, it wouldn't just anchor its market reforms that began in 1978, it would accelerate those reforms. That over time, the pressure of competing with Western economies would make China more like them. And for a few years that was true, but by the mid-2000s, it was kind of like petering out. During the presidency of Hu Jintao, it was clear that the market reforms were beginning to stall. So it turned out that the Communist Party was okay with market discipline, but not with relaxing its dominance of the Chinese economy. State-owned enterprises were not allowed to close down or were privatized. They were consolidated and they became stronger and more dominant. When Xi Jinping became president in 2012, he promised that markets would have the dominant role in the economy. But in fact, under Xi, the state's role has expanded. It hasn't shrunk. Foreign businesses had long sort of understood what the bargain was when you went to China. For access to this gigantic, glorious market, you had to accept some restrictions on your activity. But there was also this assumption that this was kind of like a transition phase, is that as China's economy and its competitive ability matured, the restrictions would lift and it would become like every other country in the WTO. But that didn't happen. In fact, the restrictions got worse. To do business in China, American companies had to give up their most valuable technology and know-how, either because they had to share it with Chinese joint venture partners, or because it was stolen by hackers, government agents, former employees. Now, it's not the only country where this goes on, but what made this especially difficult for Western companies was the realization that China did not simply wish to catch up with Western companies, it wanted to replace them. So, for example, Siemens of Germany and Kawasaki of Japan were invited to come in and help build China's high-speed rail system as joint venture partners with Chinese companies. Well, once those Chinese companies had developed the capacity to build high-speed rail just as well as Kawasaki and Siemens, those companies were basically disinvited. And the next thing they know, they were being competed against by their former Chinese joint venture partners in third markets. Huawei is now the #1 telecoms provider in the world, and it got there partly by allegedly stealing the intellectual property of Cisco and of Nortel, a company that eventually went bankrupt partly as a result of its market share losses to Huawei. In 2015, this strategy became formalized as Made in China 2025, which was a plan under which Chinese companies would supply all of China's needs in the most advanced sectors, and then having developed that expertise in the Chinese market, they would then go on to dominate global markets. This slide kind of tells a story about the attitude of businesses towards China. And it's a survey that the U.S.-China Business Council does regularly of its members and asks them, are you feeling optimistic or less optimistic about the future of business in China? And you can see that as recently as 2010, people who are more optimistic was roughly equal to those who are less optimistic. And the more optimistic numbers have been dropping until the people who are less optimistic outnumber the people who are more optimistic by about 4 to 1. So you've had this astonishing leakage or decline in optimism by the business community about doing business in China. And it wasn't just businesses, it extended to political leadership as well. Both George Bush and Barack Obama encountered deep frustration with China on things like intellectual property theft in the exchange rate, but they were reluctant to kind of force the issue, to really confront China on this because they had other priorities. They needed China's cooperation to rein in North Korea. They wanted China's cooperation on climate change and greenhouse gases. And so they sought to change China's behavior by, persuading it to to adhere to global rules and standards. So there were, cases brought before the World Trade Organization. There was the strategic economic dialogue between the U.S. and Chinese leadership. There was talk of a bilateral investment treaty. And when all that failed, Bush and then Obama, negotiated a high standards trade agreement with 11 other countries called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which did not include China, as kind of a symbol to say, here's what we could have if China would just play by the rules. Well, as it happens, the veterans of both those administrations who were involved with those efforts now conclude that they failed. Here's a couple of quotes that illustrate that. Last year, 2 former Obama officials, Kurt Campbell and Eli Ratner, they wrote, Beijing has doubled down on its state capitalist model. Cooperative and voluntary mechanisms to pry open China's economy have by and large failed. Hank Paulson, who was Bush's Treasury Secretary and was one of the most influential proponents of engagement, said this just a few months ago. The results of U.S.-China dialogue and engagement have been poor. So this brings us to Donald Trump's presidency. So he arrives in 2017 with, needless to say, a very heterodox approach to dealing with the world. Now, there are a lot of problems with Trump's view of trade in the world at large. A lot of things that you will probably learn you will not agree with after you have finished your Master's of Applied Economics here at UCLA. For example, he likes protectionism because he thinks only in terms of producers' interests rather than consumer interests. He believes trade is zero-sum and deficits mean you're losing. He thinks that making things out of metal like cars and steels is superior to any other line of work, even when that other line of work pays better. He thinks alliances and trade agreements make the U.S. weaker rather than stronger. And yet, Trump's heresy also meant that he was not wedded to the old ways of doing with China. Rather than sort of go down that path of pushing for structural reform and making China more like us, he basically said to China, you shape up or face the consequences. The result was a Section 301 report by the U.S. Trade Representative, which cataloged all the ways that China was violating its commitments to free and fair trade. Tariffs, threat of more tariffs, and now negotiations, which we are in the middle of now, which are meant to produce some sort of deal by which China will change its behavior and get rid of the tariffs by March 1st. Now, if it were just Trump talking about this and trying to figure out how to get China to behave, I think we'd already know what the deal would look like. It would basically say China would buy a lot of stuff and the trade deficit would shrink. But it's not just Trump. In fact, even though on NAFTA, NATO, and a lot of other international issues Trump is basically alone in his views, that's not the case with China. In fact, Congress and the national security establishment are full of hawks who are actually much more worried about China than Trump is. They believe China is more than just an economic threat. They see it as a geopolitical rival. Now, let's remember for a moment, no one thought that being in the WTO would turn China into a Jeffersonian democracy. As Hank Paulson himself has said, everyone always recognized that China's political evolution was solely in the hands of the Chinese people themselves. And yet it was kind of logical to think that political liberalization would follow economic liberalization. After all, that's what happened in Taiwan and South Korea, who were at one point autocracies and have become vibrant multi-party democracies. But like hopes for economic reform, hopes for political reform have been dashed in China. China has become more politically repressive at home and more belligerent with its neighbors, whether it's Hong Kong, Taiwan, or Japan, or other neighbors in the South China Sea. This has led to a hardening of attitudes throughout the national security establishment, but especially within the Trump administration and in Congress. This is all summed up in the national security strategy, which is basically the public distillation of the views of the national security establishment of the threats facing the United States. Now, throughout this document, they treat China and Russia similarly. But I want you to read these two paragraphs here, and I'll read them out to you, because they're really mostly talking about China here. China and Russia challenge American power, influence, and interest, attempting to erode American security and prosperity. They are determined to make economies less free and less fair, to grow their militaries, and to control information and data to repress their societies and expand their influence. These competitions require the United States to rethink the policies of the past 2 decades, policies based on the assumption that engagement with rivals and their inclusion in international institutions and global commerce would turn them into benign actors and trustworthy partners. You don't get much more of a categorical rejection of 15 years of diplomacy than that. In this document, the Trump administration is basically saying that economic rivalry and geopolitical rivalry are not different things. They're really the same thing, because the stronger China becomes economically, the more forbidding a competitor it becomes geopolitically. In a speech last year, a very important speech by Vice President Mike Pence, he kind of laid down the following marker. He said, China has an honored place in our vision of the world if it chooses to respect its neighbors' sovereignty, embrace free, fair, and reciprocal trade, and uphold human rights and freedom. Now that sounds like just a piece of rah-rah apple pie, American apple pie kind of thing. But it's actually very significant, because at least according to the people that I've spoken to who know this administration well, who have worked in this administration, the hawkish people in this administration, which is not everybody, but it's a lot of people, they do not think China will ever respect its neighbors' sovereignty or embrace free and fair trade or uphold human rights and freedom. And that view, that somewhat pessimistic view, basically says no single global economic order can accommodate both free market democracy like the United States and its allies pursue, and authoritarian state capitalism like what China pursues. One of them has to go. So here we sit, waiting for something to happen on March 1st. There could be quite a range of outcomes from this set of negotiations, all the way from modest tweaks to the status quo. Okay, we're going to roll back the tariffs, and in return, China will buy more natural gas, more soybeans, we'll lower the tariffs and buy a few thousand Chevrolets. All the way over to economic iron curtain, as Hank Paulson calls it. Now, predicting the outcome is hard because, look, if you're trying to predict the outcome of a hockey game or a football game, it's hard, but at least you know what both teams are trying to do. They're trying to score goals. They're trying to limit the number of goals the other team scores. You know what their bottom lines are, their motives and their strategies. That's not the case that's not the case here. China's desired end state, its bottom line, is somewhat opaque to American officials. And as it turns out, Trump's bottom line and desired end state is also somewhat opaque to American officials, and quite possibly to himself. Really settle for just a narrower trade deficit? That's what China hopes, because it is easy to deliver. You know, like I was saying, just buy more energy and ag products. Or does he want China to really change its behavior, scrap the technology transfer, the discriminatory regulations, made in China in 2025, become like every other member of the World Trade Organization as we had hoped in 2001? Well, Trump seems to change his mind often. Just follow his Twitter feed. Tugged in one direction one day by his, let's make a deal instincts and by his dovish officials, tugged the other the next day by his, inbred suspicion of China and by his more hawkish advisors. So I do not know what the outcome will be, and it may be that we won't find out on March 1st, that in fact we'll just get an extension as they continue talking. But I do believe, and I know this, that if the China hawks carry the day, They are skeptical that China will change its behavior. That is not in China does not perceive it in its own interest to change its behavior. And if they carry the day, we're heading for a decoupling between these two gigantic economies and possibly a new Cold War. Well, what do I mean by decoupling? What would this look like? So even though this term new Cold War gets tossed around, the China hawks don't really think that it will be like the other Cold War, the one that prevailed between the US and the USSR. There will still be a lot of trade. They have no objection to the US trading natural gas, cars, and clothing with China. They only wish to sever those ties that are vital to China's goal of achieving technological and military parity with the US. I'm going to quote from Derek Scissors, who's an economist at the American Enterprise Institute and one of the leading China hawks in the national security establishment. This is what he says about decoupling. 2 years from now, our technological lead over China will be bigger than it is now, and that has economic and national security benefits for the United States. They acquire less technology that they can use against us in an actual war. So that pretty much sums it up. What would this actually look like as a practical matter? Well, let me go through roughly 5 different aspects. On trade, tariffs on imports will remain. But more important, the threat of tariffs and various non-tariff barriers will become a permanent threat, always looming over any prospective or actual investment that a Western company wants to make in China. And this will inevitably cause some foreign manufacturers to move production out of China. And in fact, it's already underway. It's called China Plus One, according to the people who talk to companies over there. The strategy is this: you keep your existing facilities in China, but when you come time to open new capacity, you open it elsewhere. You open it in India, or Indonesia, or Vietnam, Bangladesh, or Malaysia, maybe even Mexico. You don't do this lightly. There's a reason you're in China. No other country offers its massive internal market, its combination of reliable infrastructure, skilled labor, big network of local suppliers for almost anything. Those are pretty important things to have, but it can be done. I give you the example of Samsung. Starting 5 years ago, they began to shift smartphone production out of China towards Vietnam. Today, they now employ 160,000 people there. It's the primary source of their smartphone production. And Vietnam has begun to develop its own endogenous supply chain to service Samsung. So, channel number two. Through diplomatic, legal, and economic measures, the United States will seek to slow Chinese technology acquisition more intensely. We've already seen examples of how this will work. So the Trump administration at one point nearly put ZTE, a Chinese state-owned telecom company, out of business because of its sanctions violations, by threatening to bar any American company from selling vital components to that company. Now, eventually the administration dialed it back. Xi and Trump had a phone call, and Trump said, okay, give us $1 billion and change your board of directors and we'll call it a deal. But there were many in Congress who actually weren't happy with this, like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, who actually wanted Trump to issue a death sentence to ZTE, which kind of makes my point that this isn't just about Trump, but about other forces operating in the United States. Congress has granted the administration broader authority to screen foreign investment, mostly Chinese investment, in the United States, not just in sensitive military areas, but in any technology area. In theory, under this new rule, even a Chinese acquisition of a healthcare company could be seen as threatening to the national interest, because it would give Chinese companies and potentially the Chinese state access to Americans' health records. Channel number 3 of decoupling. The U.S. will use its diplomatic and economic leverage to compel its allies to follow its lead. So again, Huawei is kind of like a test run. Australia and New Zealand have already banned Huawei from their telecom systems. Britain, Germany, Japan, and Canada are all contemplating doing the same. The U.S. inserted a poison pill into the new NAFTA agreement, and it basically says that if Canada tries to do a free trade agreement with China, it will lose its free trade agreement with the United States. The United States has already said that they want to use that as a model clause that they wish to insert in all future trade agreements that they sign. Channel number 4, technology will continue to silo into separate, contained systems around the world. The internet, which its founders dreamed would be this one open common standard around the world, has in some already siloed. the Chinese internet is walled off from the rest of the world. Most big US social media companies like Facebook, Twitter, and Google are unavailable in China. And it would not be surprising if eventually the United States makes it impossible for Alibaba or WeChat to offer their products in the United States. You know, China once used indigenous 3G and 4G mobile communication standards to give its own companies an advantage over foreign competitors. It's possible the United States will seek to do the same thing with 5G, establish separate standards for the rest of the world to keep Chinese equipment off Western telecom networks. And fifth and finally, the following is only at a speculative stage now, but we might see that this decoupling in the trade and investment field extends to work, education, and culture. Chinese students might face higher barriers to attending American universities, especially in STEM subjects. Scientific exchanges between American and Chinese scientists may be restricted. So, supposing we go down this route, what are the consequences? And most important, how will China respond? Well, if you're a reporter covering China, eventually you become frustrated because you discover that every Chinese official says the same thing. I don't know, somehow they collect all their talking points in the morning and then they repeat them all right down to a man. And it's a little bit frustrating because you don't kind of get that variety. And the talking points today are decoupling is bad for both US and China, so let's not do it. So if there's a plan B, they're not telling us what it is. Yet, in a sense, China has been contingency planning for 20 years. That's really what China 2025 is all about. It's about pursuing self-sufficiency and all the technology for which it now depends on others. And the fact of the matter is China has already made astonishing progress in this direction. As I've said a couple of times, Huawei is the world's largest supplier of telecoms equipment. Lenovo is the world's largest supplier of PC computers. 3 of the largest smartphone makers are Chinese. 3 of the 10 largest semiconductor packagers are Chinese. 2 of the 10 largest fabless semiconductor manufacturers are Chinese. In artificial intelligence, the people who know this area best say China may already be ahead of the United States thanks to a market of 1 billion people from which to derive algorithms without a lot of the complicated privacy restraints that take place in democracies. Many Americans think Now here I'm going to get into something a bit more complicated, because when I talk about this subject, a lot of people in American officialdom think the only reason China got to where it was is basically by breaking the rules. State-sanctioned expropriation of Western know-how. And without that, they could not have made this progress. And I think this view is deeply flawed for a couple of reasons, because I think it fundamentally misunderstands why China's economic success is so astonishing. And because it misunderstands that, it underestimates how much progress China can potentially continue to make, even if the United States decouples from it. First of all, China has enormous indigenous technology capacity, by which I mean the ability to adopt and design technological advances irrespective of how much it interacts with the United States. Chinese authors today now account for 19% of publications in international scientific journals. Chinese startups today attract almost as much venture capital as US startups. Beijing and Shanghai are hotbeds of startups the way Silicon Valley is. Intel and Microsoft don't have R&D centers in China just because they're trying to please the Chinese government. It happens to be a pretty smart thing because there's so much Chinese talent for them to draw on there. Chinese policymakers have a much deeper appreciation of what science and technology and engineering and math can do for your country than they do here in the United States. I had an interesting conversation with Willie Shi, who is a professor of supply chain management at Harvard Business School, who visits China often because he advises a lot of companies and he teaches about international supply chains. And he tells me the following story. I was having dinner with the economic development team of a third-tier city in China. And as part of the introduction, I went around the table and I asked each official what he had studied in school. Metallurgy, said one. Industrial engineering, said another. Metallurgy, said a third. Mechanical engineering, says a fourth. They were all engineers. In China, the government is run by technocrats. Here, it is run by lawyers. So that's point number one about the different culture in China. Point number two is the idea that the copycat nature of Chinese technology adoption is somehow a rule or a policy that was dreamed up in the bowels of the Chinese State Council, then rolled out and imposed on everybody. and all I have to do is like repeal that, and all this goes away. But copycat is not some rule. It is actually part of Chinese culture. I learned about this by reading a wonderful book by Yu Hua, who is a Chinese novelist. He had published a collection of essays called China in 10 Words, and each word is meant to explain, he devotes a chapter to each of these words to explain why it tells you something about China. The 9th word he discusses is copycat, in Pinyin, shanzhai. Yu notes that, he talks about how knockoff brands are rampant throughout China. Cell phones, digital cameras, instant noodles, sodas, milk, medications, laundry detergent, sports shoes, all of them knockoff brands everywhere. Not just knockoffs of Western brands, Chinese companies knocking off Chinese brands. Every name, image, meme is fair game for expropriation, modification, repurposing. Chinese ads use fake endorsements by Barack Obama and lookalikes of Mao Zedong. And then he tells the following story, which I just got a huge kick out of as a journalist. He said, he writes, "I'm often amazed to read interviews that I have never given. Remarks that a reporter has simply concocted, a gushing stream of drivel attributed to me. Once I ran into a reporter who had fabricated just such an interview, and I told him firmly, 'I have never been interviewed by you ever.' And he responded just as firmly, 'That was a copycat interview.'" So decoupling may limit the ability of Chinese companies to acquire American technology, but China's copycat culture, which is a hidden source of its economic dynamism and its advantage, will endure. Kai-Fu Lee, anybody here heard of Kai-Fu Lee? Yep, yes, okay. A prominent technology executive, used to be head of Google China. And today he's a venture capitalist and investor. He splits his time between Silicon Valley and China. And he illustrates this point really well in his recent bestseller, AI Superpowers. He says this of Chinese technology entrepreneurs. They live in a world where speed is essential, copying is an accepted practice, and competitors will stop at nothing to win in a new market. If one's only edge is a single novel idea, that idea will invariably be copied. Your key employees will be poached, and you'll be driven out of business by venture capital subsidized competitors. This rough and tumble environment makes a strong contrast to Silicon Valley, where copying is stigmatized, and many companies are allowed to coast on the basis of one original idea or lucky break. The messy markets of China's copycat era produced some questionable companies, but they also incubated a generation of the world's most nimble, savvy, and nose-to-the-grindstone entrepreneurs. And he has a couple of great examples in the book. Like, for example, the bike rental industry, which was basically invented in China. You go to these big Chinese cities, and you trip over these bikes everywhere. And the companies, they go out and they steal and vandalize each other's bikes. So Americans who think that Chinese entrepreneurs are always systematically stealing American technology, don't take it personally. They're stealing each other's technology as well. Kai-Fu Lee says that the U.S. Still leads when it comes to having brilliant superstar researchers, and they will be the ones first with the breakthroughs. But once a breakthrough is made, commercial success depends on tweaking, modifying, and diffusing that breakthrough. And that, he says, is where China will win, because China excels in that, just through the brute force, the sheer number of talented, capable engineers and researchers it has, and their willingness to copy. Anybody here heard of an economist named Paul Romer? Oh, come on. He won the Nobel Prize last year, okay? He's going to be he's going to be the distinguished speaker 2 weeks from now, right? Okay. He maybe not, but he should be, all right? Anyway, he won the Nobel Prize for his work on growth theory, specifically endogenous growth. And the most central insight about Paul Romer's research is that growth comes from ideas. And here's what's special about ideas. First of all, they're non-rival. What does that mean? It means once an idea is created, it can be copied and diffused endlessly at no additional cost to 1 million more people. The Pythagorean theorem, you know what I mean? One of the most amazing breakthroughs in human knowledge, and that is free to everybody, whether you like it or not. Any kids here taking trigonometry? I'm sure they wish that there was it wasn't free. Ideas are not just non-rival, they're non-excludable. You can't stop someone else from using them. Oh, okay, yes, you can have patents, you can have other controls, but eventually everybody gets access to every idea. And when they do, Chinese engineers, entrepreneurs, and scientists will be there to exploit them. So while decoupling may slow down China's progress, it will not hold it back, thanks to these built-in advantages in China. I had a colleague once who once wrote that Chinese capitalism in some ways is more Darwinian than American capitalism. The most formidable, so if you want to know why China is doing so well, it is because that capitalist, vibrancy has been unleashed in the last 20, 30 years. And that's why I say the biggest barrier to Chinese progress towards leadership are its own built-in barriers. So for example, China's economy is rapidly aging. In fact, last year was the first year in history that China's population actually shrank. Deaths exceeded births. And some of the natural low-hanging fruit of industrialization, of urbanization, has already been plucked. Invariably, China is going to grow more slowly in the next few years than it did in the last 30 or 40 years. It's, growth rates of 6% are still enviable, but they're half of what China has enjoyed over the last few decades, and they're going to be lower still. Now, the Chinese government has sought to sustain growth rates with repeated rounds of fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus, and opening the spigots to easy credit. But with each new round, it discovers that it must borrow more to achieve the same result. And meanwhile, because that stimulus is usually directed at state-owned enterprises, it crowds out the private sector. It crowds the private sector of the resources it needs, the talent, the land, the credit. It cuts back on that wonderful dynamism that I've just been describing. And it hinders China's transition to a more innovative, consumer-driven economy. In other words, the biggest threat to China's growth is not the United States or decoupling, it's its own government and its own policies. So what does the rest of the world, so I've just explained why I think that decoupling is not simply a matter of the United States stops doing business with China and China suddenly comes to a halt. There's another aspect of decoupling which I think advocates within the US establishment have not fully grappled with. And that is, what does the rest of the world do in this scenario? In the original Cold War, it was the Soviet Union on one and its communist allies on one side, and the US and the free market democracies on the other. And there really wasn't a lot of mixing between the two. It was a really easy choice to make. Well, if there's a new Cold War, the question then naturally arises, what are the other countries going to do? Will they too have to pick sides? Well, I can say that certainly hope not. But some will not have any choice. As I said, Canada was not given a choice when it signed a new North American Free Trade Agreement. It had to agree to the poison pill that it could not do a free trade agreement with China unless it was willing to risk losing its free trade agreement with the United States. And really, when it comes to picking sides, it should be no contest. The U.S. has open markets, the rule of law, institutions, and culture that are widely admired. Its soft power, say what you like about its military power or its economic power, its soft power was and remains unrivaled. Other countries do fear and they do respect China, but very few want to be like China. As one Chinese official told Hank Paulson, "You have all the good allies." Moreover, under Xi Jinping, China has become in some ways a more menacing presence. Other countries like Canada, the European Union, Japan, they share the US's suspicion of China's designs on their technology. They've seen up front the pressure on their own companies from Chinese overproduction of certain products like steel and aluminum, and they worry about Chinese appropriation of their technology, whether it's robotics or avionics. And meanwhile, on a geopolitical front, they're all nervous about China's increasingly, aggressive posture in the South China Sea. And yet the U.S. has far less of the leverage that it had during the original Cold War. South Korea and Australia are American allies. But if you look at the bottom of this, if you look at this chart, you'll see that they also happen to trade a lot more with China than they do with the United States. That's a situation the United States didn't have when it was trying to keep its allies on board during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. South Korea and Australia, much as they want the umbrella of the United States military protection, they can't afford to turn their backs on China. And besides, Chinese technological leadership is less of a threat to them than it is to the United States, because that's where the United States' comparative advantage is, but it's not the comparative advantage for those other countries. Britain wants to sell financial services to China. Canada wants to sell them energy products and agricultural products. Germany wants to sell them machine tools. They want that market. They will not turn their backs on it lightly. So all of the economics that you see here, the fact that China is such an important trading partner for so many countries, the fact that they want to do business with China, that would that alone would be a pretty important challenge, a sort of a structural headwind to the United States making the most of this new Cold War. But even if what I'm trying to say is, even if the U.S. made the best possible case that it could to its allies, it would be a tough sell. But here's the thing: the U.S. is not making the best possible case. In fact, it's kind of like doing the opposite. The Trump administration has challenged a lot of the foundations of the alliances and free trade agreements that have kind of underpinned the global liberal order for the last 70 years. The administration left, it pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has since continued with the 11 remaining countries. It actually encouraged Britain to leave the European Union. In fact, the European Union sometimes wonders whether Trump would prefer that the European Union simply disintegrate. He has been highly critical of NATO. He has reportedly thought about pulling out of NATO, allegedly. He rewrote NAFTA, threatened to pull out of NAFTA, still threatens to pull out of NAFTA. He's bringing the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism to a halt because he will not approve new judges being appointed to its dispute settlement body. So this is very unsettling to other countries. And if they do not think that they can count on the U.S. in military or economic matters, they'll have to hedge their bets. They will be more hesitant to confront or defy China. And China has not exactly been idle. It's going around trying to persuade its neighbors that it is actually a reliable and useful partner to have. Take, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative. This is an impressive piece of checkbook diplomacy. A lot of money being spent to build a lot of infrastructure in places like Thailand and Malaysia and Pakistan. Now, it's been controversial, including in some of those countries. The United States is going around saying this is debt diplomacy. You take this initiative from China, you'll end up deeply in debt to China, and you'll regret it. Yeah, there are problems with it, but do not underestimate China's ability to learn from its mistakes and to come back and make it better. And then there's this. Kevin Rudd is the former Prime Minister of Australia, and he's about as knowledgeable and thoughtful a person as they come in terms of the future of China and the New World Order. And he writes this: the central strategic factor working in China's favor in Southeast Asia is the absence of an American or European alternative, any alternative to Chinese markets, Chinese investment, and Chinese capital. So it really doesn't matter how much we say, how much we lobby and browbeat and sort of use our soft power to criticize the Chinese. The fact of the matter is they're there, their money is there, and we're not. So I'm going to finish off with this discussion by saying that even though I don't know where things are going, I can draw a few lessons and recommendations from the past. A central part of the U.S. strategy contained in the Soviet Union during the original Cold War was its commitment to alliances of mutual defense and to global economic rules that kept markets open and kept countries like the Soviet Union at bay. That was a liberal order that the United States built, developed, and stood by through one president to another. And they are useful things that the United States should revisit as it contemplates the possibility of a new Cold War with China. In fact, it is quite possible that if it sufficiently learns the lessons of the past and puts them to work today, that no Cold War will be necessary, because China will have realized that the United States isn't just the United States. It stands for a global economic order that China should and would like to be part of. And that's all for my formal remarks. I think we have about 30 minutes, I guess, and I welcome any questions or comments on this or any other topic that's on your mind, including socialism. Yes.
I want to pick up on the Belt and Road that you just mentioned. I heard on a conference call today that an example of Sri Lanka, that the Chinese came in and helped them develop a port, all with the people of Sri Lanka, the government, going in debt to China to do this. And apparently there wasn't enough business to support it so that they could start making the interest payments. And so the Chinese eventually just came in and took over the port. Is that accurate?
I don't know that case specifically enough. I recollect hearing something exactly to that effect, but it would not surprise me.
Okay, I'm sorry. If it is accurate and that story gets out, don't you think that's going to cause the Chinese a great deal of trouble as they try to develop in that area?
Well, I believe the story is already out. I think that's why I know about it. I read it in the news somewhere. So a couple things. First of all, if the reason it's not making money is that nobody actually uses this infrastructure, then the fact that China now owns it doesn't really get it very far. It now owns basically a stranded asset. So I think it raises a couple of issues. First of all, I think that Sri Lanka and Malaysia and Pakistan, as they grapple with the actual construction of these projects, they discover that the fact that China wanted, for example, to build a rail line from Karachi to China may have suited China's ambitions, but it doesn't really suit Pakistan's. And so they end up with this very expensive infrastructure that does not actually offer an economic return. And now they have all this debt. So I think it starts to sour them on Belt and Road a little bit and make them a little bit more skeptical. A much more interesting case is Malaysia, where China has financed the construction of a railroad running down the east coast of the Malaysian peninsula. Now, it turns out that when the new government came in, they said, well, why did we do this? Most of the traffic's on the other side of the peninsula. This is not where we would have wanted it. And why did we pay twice as much as we should have? Well, it turns out because allegedly, the money that Malaysia was paying to the Chinese to build this stuff, the Chinese were then kicking back very large portions of that to Malaysian government officials who are now have been arrested and are under investigation for corruption. So that, I think, is exposing a rather unseemly side to Belt and Road. And it is possible that as time goes on, that the potency of this particular initiative will prove to be far less than we've made it out to be in the last couple of years. In fact, I read a very thoughtful analysis by David Fickling, who's a columnist for Bloomberg News, and he compared Belt and Road to what the Soviet Union did in terms of trying to develop and populate Siberia in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So the Soviet Union spent enormous amounts of its oil wealth building these cities out, in the middle of nowhere, and it was a gigantic waste of money. And it ended up being essentially a deadweight loss on the Soviet economy. And he's saying that the same thing may happen in China. So I take all that, but I think that there might be a little bit too much triumphalism on the part of these critics of Belt and Road. As I said, the Chinese are very adaptable and they learn. And the next round of Belt and Road projects will be much more thoughtful. There will be much more input from the recipient countries. There will be much more cost basis. So I would suspect that we are not witnessing the end of Belt and Road. I suspect that it may be a way station as a project is redesigned.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
Thanks for coming, John Posen, Anderson School. To the point you made about the Kevin Rudd quote,
Yeah.
Do you think that there is any chance that Western powers will sort of take this lesson to heart and take a more integrated, aggressive and approach to FDI in the region, or are they just too disorganized and too resource constrained?
Well, so you can already actually see steps going in this direction. So to give you one example, the trade ministers of Japan, the European Union, and the United States are all meeting regularly to talk about ways to reform the World Trade Organization, to change the rules, to better deal with the problems of hidden Chinese subsidies, forced technology transfer, and so forth. And partly this is because of a sense of perceived shared risk. So when a Chinese company bought a German robotics maker called KUKA a few years ago, this actually aroused a great deal of consternation in Germany and very similar worries to what you see here in the United States about China acquiring Germany's technological crown jewels and maybe one day competing it out of markets in the future. And as a consequence, partly under pressure from Emmanuel Macron, the European Union has now set up a cooperative system of foreign investment screening that is meant to be a much tighter screen of Chinese investment coming in. But I would say that the prospects of a more united front, of a shared approach by the United States and the other countries, are not good. And the reason why is because of the diversity of interests. As I said a moment in my prepared remarks, a lot of countries don't worry about as much about technology transfer as the United States does. And they do want to sell China a lot of stuff. And they want Chinese capital investment. And then you have the fact that the United States has managed to alienate all these countries. I want to show you a slide here, actually. So the United States has, up until recently, was suffering from large gluts of steel, was driving the price of steel down. It was causing steel factories to be idled and steel workers to lose their jobs. So when President Trump came in, he decided that's got to come to an end. I've got to find a way to protect all these steel jobs and steel companies. And so he basically searched through the record books and he found a very obscure passage in a 1962 law that said the president can impose tariffs to protect national security on basically anything he wants. And so he imposed 25% across-the-board tariffs on steel imports. When I say across the board, I mean across the board. Every single country, Brazil, South Korea, China, Japan, Canada, Western Europe, face these tariffs. Now, the bizarre thing here is that the United States actually imports very little steel from China. And the reason why is that previous presidents had been upset by China's behavior and imposed all these tariffs on China. So all the steel coming into the United States came primarily from other Western countries. And strangely enough, these same countries are dealing with exactly the same problem. This chart shows you that since the year 2000, almost all the growth in steel capacity in the world has been in China. It has capacity in the rest of the world has actually shrunk. Or at least the rest of the OECD has actually shrunk. So the United States basically, I remember sending out a tweet like that, says, so to deal with an Chinese dumping of steel, we've just imposed tariffs on Canada. This would be like FDR responding to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor by invading Mexico. To which a former Mexican diplomat responded to me on Twitter, Greg, don't give them ideas. The point is, by going after our allies who have the same problem with us, they're kind of like making it much harder to generate the goodwill to pursue a united front. And it's not just a matter of bad blood. I mean, trying to deal with all these issues, it consumes time. I don't think Trump realizes this, that when he says we're going to have a trade deal with Britain, or we're going to have a trade deal with Japan, or we're going to trade deal with, does he realize how many tens of thousands of tariff lines have to be negotiated? Does he actually plan to personally sit down and read them all? It takes years to do that. This is hard work. And before any of that work can be done, we've got to work our way through all these tariffs. So by that I mean, although in theory, to your question, should we have a united front? Yes. As a practical matter, it's going to be hard. Next question.
So it sounds like China invests a lot in other developing countries. The countries like those investments. They may vote with China in the WTO and the UN. So this debt diplomacy seems to be going really well for China. Why is that so bad? Why doesn't the U.S. do something similar?
Well, that's a very good question. In fact, in that speech from Mike Pence that I quoted, he did talk about creating like an initiative to help finance, infrastructure and technology in developing countries. I don't remember the number, but it was a fraction of Belt and Road. I mean, our Export Development Bank, you can say whether Export-Import Bank, which is one of the primary tools by which we promote the sale of United States goods to other countries, including some of these same countries where we're competing with Chinese companies, its authorization lapsed several years ago and has not been renewed. So they are not able to make new loans. I mean, if you actually are in a competitive situation with China, you may want to think about actually using some of the tools that are around. So if the United States wants to get serious about competing dollar for dollar with China, as I said, it's not enough to say we have the best rock and roll and the best Coca-Cola. We actually got to start putting our money and our diplomacy where our mouth is, and that's what's not happening.
Hi, Mr. Ip. Thank you for coming. I just want to say I follow you on Twitter, even though I don't understand most of the things that you tweet. I'm very grateful for you that you came here. My question to you, you mentioned the TPP and Trump pulling out. Do you think that there's any hope that maybe the U.S. ends up joining that agreement, or do you think that the U.S. should try to pursue bilateral trade agreements with those countries? And yeah, do you think ultimately that we'll be able to find a way back in that?
I don't think we will under this administration, because this administration has a very strong view that joining multilateral agreements is a very bad idea, because in order to, maybe you really want to basically like achieve some particular, concession from Japan, and so you offer something to Japan, but then you have to turn around and offer to 10 other countries. And that, in the view of Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, dilutes the United States' leverage. It is much easier for the United States to go around and pick off these countries one by one, because the United States is the big dog when it comes to each of those bilateral relationships. So even though I think at some level, a lot of folks in this administration, including Trump, probably realize the value of joining something like the TPP and its value as a bulwark against Chinese influence, they cannot bring themselves, I think, to overcome their deep suspicion of these multilateral agreements. I think it's quite possible that under a future president or a future administration that we might re-enter it. It's also possible that if China actually starts moving in the direction that it's been urged to in terms of like reducing the power and influence of state-owned enterprises, that you might end up in a scenario one day where China's allowed to join the TPP. I mean, I would consider that a low probability event. But I think for now, I think my sort of medium-term view on globalization and trade is that the best we can hope for is for no backsliding. We're in a period where I think that we may have pushed free trade and globalization faster than the people who live with its consequences were politically willing to tolerate. And so you've seen this backlash, not just in the United States, but in Britain and Western Europe and so forth. And I think that those who believe that these arrangements are good need to sort of sit back, consolidate those, make the case to their voters why they should keep them. And that'll be the true same in the United States. There's still, even though there's a lot of suspicion among Trump's voters and even among Democrats these days about free trade, it still has strong staying power. I mean, if you look at NAFTA, it's very hard to actually find any Democrats, even liberal Democrats, who want to get out of it, right? And so I think that it has, in some sense, this is kind of the story of U.S. trade policy for the last 200 years, is that once a particular arrangement, whether it's tariffs or free trade, settles in place, particular constituents build up and they're very comfortable with it. So I do not think that, notwithstanding Trump's instincts, we're going to tear up a lot of trade agreements over the next few years. But it will be a very difficult time, for entering new trade agreements, including the TPP.
If I might ask, do you think, generally speaking, bilateral trade agreements are better than multilateral trade agreements? Do you share that suspicion, or do you think that they equally have?
I just don't think you can generalize. Thorough, deep bilateral agreements are better than shallow multilateral agreements. It's really case by case. China has a lot of multilateral agreements, but they're very weak agreements, like the agreement with Taiwan, if I recall, has like pages and pages of exceptions, right, of things that aren't covered by the trade agreement. So is that a good agreement? Not really, So.
Thank you for your talk this evening. I just wanted to ask, how likely do you think it is that major internal political instability sends this whole narrative off course in either the United States or in China?
I don't think it's going to happen in the United States. I wrote a column last week that was a little bit controversial when I said that a lot of people thought that when Trump was elected, that this was a major threat to democracy. You had books like How Democracies Die going on the bestseller list. Comparisons made to like Venezuela or to Nazi Germany. And I think that 2 years into his presidency, we can say none of those bad scenarios have happened. We just had a peaceful transfer of power of the House of Representatives. The 35-day shutdown is nothing pretty to look at, but it basically did what it did. It forced Trump to back down. As I like to say, Trump didn't lose to Nancy Pelosi, he lost to James Madison, who talked about how the power of the purse was the most powerful tool you could hand to people in a constitution. Trump used to talk about threaten to lock up his opponents. Well, here we are 2 years in. Not one of his opponents has been locked up, but 6 of Trump's friends have been indicted or pleaded guilty. So Trump talked about rewriting the libel laws and saying we're going to rewrite the libel laws and shut down the free press. Well, the free press is bigger and more vigorous than ever, And look at the share price of the New York Times Company, and it's hard to say that the free press is suffering a lot. Anybody seen the news about Amazon today and the Washington Post and National Enquirer? I would submit that that is the product of a vigorous free press, and it ain't always pretty, but that's what you get. So I worry a lot less about whether the U.S. will go in the direction of instability that you talked about, I think, than we worried about a few years ago. China is a great big black box, and I wonder if there's anybody here who's studied this issue and is willing to put their hand and make a much more confident prediction than I can. I'm actually in the middle of reading a book now by John Pomfret called The Middle Kingdom and the Beautiful Country, and it's a history of U.S. relations with China. And if you are interested in China, just go read that book. It's wonderful. I mean, the wonderful thing about it is just how often Americans have been wrong about China in both directions. And part of it is that Chinese have often been wrong about themselves. I mean, they aspire to a lot of the same things that Americans want, but then something happens, a civil war happens, or Japan invades, or something like that. And it's very unpredictable how all these sort of dynamics turn out. You know, China, in some sense, is an ancient country, but it's a young regime. It's been a communist country only since 1949, and the reform and opening up period is only 40 years old. They actually had settled upon a regime where they changed leaders every 10 years, and that regime is already over now that Xi Jinping is leader for life. So in some sense, you could see signs of instability in the Chinese system already reemerging, not that different from what has been the case for the last 100 years. So one thing I've learned about predicting is don't do it. Especially in situations like China, which have made idiots of so many predictors in the past.
Hi, my question is actually kind of similar, but I'm reading a book kind of by Freddie Zakaria, and he's talking about how with the rise of the middle class in the capitalist world, it's historically inevitable that a country turns into a democratic society. But in the case of China, it seems like a very different scenario. But at the same time, the world order kind of only stands as it is if there's a strong central government at play. So I guess I'm curious about if you see any shift or signs of a shift towards more capitalist society within China, and whether or not China's collaborations with other countries are based on developing, say, co-leaders in their vision for the world, or becoming kind of the hegemony within their economic structure.
Okay, I think there's 3 questions in there, and all very good questions, but I'm probably going to forget one of them, so forgive me. On your very first question, this question of whether when you become middle class, you become democratic, Robert Barrow of Harvard University did a very thorough study where he basically looked at every country he could find over the last 60 years, and he found 0 correlation between economic growth and democracy. It's kind of like a bedtime story that we tell ourselves. Economists started out as political economists, and they like to think that economic freedom and political freedom go hand in hand. But unfortunately, the data came along and kind of like ruined our party. And it doesn't really show that. I mean, you know, Aaron, we were talking about Chile, right? I mean, Chile, you know, elected a socialist leader. And I believe the line attributed to Henry Kissinger was, we're not going to stand by and let a country go communist through the irresponsibility of its own people. And there was a coup, and it was ruled by a military dictatorship for how many years? 10, 20? From 73 until, anyway. And Chile grew very fast in that period. And if you were to compare China to India, you know, for a very long time, or even Indonesia today, I mean, Indonesia is democratic, you can see all sorts of signs of the way democratic pressures actually hold these countries back from doing the right thing. In the case of China, you asked, I think, is China trying to export its political model to other countries? Was that the gist of your question?
Yeah. So if they're trying to develop co-leaders within their vision.
No, I don't think they are. As I said, there are a lot of countries that respect China and fear China, that want to do business with China, but I don't think there are many countries that want to be like China. And China itself is, you know, very well aware of this, and that is why part of the talking points that all Chinese officials have is that every country must be allowed to develop its own system. So, for example, the line about, you know, the Chinese officially told Hank Paulson, you can have all the best allies. You know, who are China's allies? Cambodia, North Korea, kind of it. And even the Cambodians are actually kind of moving in a democratic direction, if you think about it. And before long, North Korea will be like, you know, playing golf with Trump. You know, it's in Florida on a regular basis. So, no, I do. And I think that's actually an important point, because it is one of the most profound differences between the new Cold War and the old Cold War, is that at least nominally the Soviet Union was very much dedicated to exporting its ideology to the rest of the world. And that is why the United States waged proxy wars with China throughout the world. China doesn't do that. There is as yet no sign that China is interested in exporting its ideological revolution to the rest of the world. It may wish to reassert its centrality in its part of the world, But as yet, we do not see that manifesting itself as an ideological struggle, very different from the 1950s and the 1960s. And I think that is one reason why this Cold War, if it's to be a Cold War, will be quite different from the old Cold War. But was there a third question? I think there was, but I can't remember what it was.
I think those are my main two.
Oh, is that right?
But
Okay.
I can ask about the flip side about the U.S. If you think the U.S. is trying to develop co-leaders at this point, or just kind of sustain their level of autonomy or hegemony in the world.
So I think that if you listen to Trump's inaugural speech in 2017, in the immortal words of George W. Bush, that was some weird shit. But he says in that speech, it's actually a pretty good distillation of Trump's views, which is that we do not seek to impose our way of life on the rest of the world. That sounds kind of, uncontroversial, but it actually happens not to be true. We spent a lot of blood and treasure trying to impose our way of life on a lot of the world. We propped up Western Europe, we propped up Japan and South Korea. We imposed democracy or quasi-democracy, market systems on those countries. And as I said, we spent a lot of blood and treasure to keep them that way. We did it on this like tragic effort in Iraq. So Trump's assertion that we're not going to do that any longer, if it were to be true, and if it were to be actualized in American policy, would be a profound departure from American history. But I'm not really sure it's going to happen. As I said in my speech, on many of these issues, Trump is basically a party of one. And you do not find a lot of agreement for that position in either of the major parties, in Congress, in the public, and even within the administration itself. And going back to what I said to you, to the other questioner, 2 years ago, I was a lot more worried than I am today about where the United States goes in some of these directions.
Thank you.
Good evening. So picking up on the theme of the Chinese state potentially being its own worst enemy vis-a-vis its own development, how successful do you think China has been in terms of cleaning up its zombie industries, as I've heard them called, non-productive industries inside the country?
It's a great question, and it's one that makes a lot of people worried a lot, all the time. The people that I talk to believe they've made significant progress, but there's still a lot of zombification out there, a lot of zombie companies. The approach of the Chinese government, unfortunately, was to basically, in many cases, go to a particular industry and take 3 failing, money-losing state-owned enterprises and merge them into one very large, failing, money-losing state-owned enterprise. And then to keep it alive by ordering its failing, money-losing state-owned banks to keep lending money to those state-owned enterprises so that they were never allowed to fail. And if you actually look at the data on where credit is going, is that from, I'm sort of like, don't quote these numbers, but roughly speaking, from the 90s until a few, 5 or 6 years ago, the share of credit going to state-owned enterprises was shrinking while the share going to the private sector was expanding. Well, that's stopped, and it's been creeping up. The share going to the state-owned enterprises has been going up. I mean, I actually do believe that while political reform is more or less hibernating in China, economic reform is still alive. That if you listen to the people, for example, in the central bank and the Securities Commission, there's still a desire and a will and ability to further reform forward in terms of something as simple as deregulating deposit rates so that Chinese savers actually get competitive returns on their savings instead of having to invest them in all these shady sort of trust fund products. So I think that in fits and starts, the process of turning the Chinese financial system into a genuine market-driven system where bad credits are cut off and good credits are rewarded will continue in fits and starts. But there's no question that has slowed down dramatically and that it poses considerable risks that the Chinese authorities are very aware of.
So recently we've seen China make deals with many African countries, for example, and many Asian countries you mentioned, where they've offered to build certain resources such as dams, infrastructure, in return to and offered to alleviate debt in terms of long-term long-term dependence. So traditionally, we found that the U.S. has made ties and allies through diplomatic connections, whereas we see China, on the other hand, who seems to be going about making allies or through economic dependence and leverage. So what are your views on this? Would you see this as a potential threat and a potential danger? And if there is going to be a lot of leverage, in the long run, how impactful would you think it is?
So it sort of takes us back to the first question that we got here. So the Chinese proposition to African countries is, if you want to go borrow money from the World Bank or the United States or the African Development Bank, they're going to come in here with a bunch of auditors and they're going to ask for like a proof that you're not corrupt, and they're going to ask for good governance, and they're going to demand you do cost-benefit analysis and all that fancy frou-frou stuff. And by the way, if you have any human rights problems, if you're imprisoning any activists or something like that, the United States is probably going to veto the loan anyway. Come to us. We're not going to ask a lot of really touchy questions like that. What happens in Darfur stays in Darfur. Just take the money, build the stuff. We want to sell you all this stuff. Really, easy. Nobody cries. Well, as I was discussing with the first questioner, I think we're seeing countries where we're discovering that that's not been a great proposition for a lot of these countries. They're finding that the terms are very onerous and that the returns are not great. As it happens, who knew? If you actually forced a borrower to do a cost-benefit analysis, they didn't take so many bad loans. And when I was in Davos, I heard the new president of Ethiopia speak, and it was actually pretty inspiring. I mean, this is a country that's been sort of like flirted with Marxist dictatorships, nationalist dictatorships. Now you have this inspiring leader who's just made half of his cabinet women. He's released political prisoners, and he's coming to the United States. He's coming to all the multilaterals. He's saying, "Help us out, lend us money, make it happen." The interim head of Venezuela, if there ends up being a change of government in Venezuela, it will be partly because the United States and its allies brought the full force of their financial and economic leverage to bear on the Maduro government. And I am fairly confident that if there's a change of government and a democratic government comes in and rescues Venezuela, that the taps will be open to World Bank funding, IADB funding, IMF funding, all these things. And I think that is proof that the U.S., and I'm calling it the U.S. system, but it's really the global system. It's really the liberal democratic market-driven system is actually a pretty good system. I mean, China is sitting there saying, we just want, Venezuela not to default on all the money they borrowed from us. And I think that they are not going to be at the front of the line in terms of getting paid back if there's a change of government in Venezuela. So from where I stand right now, I would not count out the American system. I think, as I said in my remarks, a lot of things the United States could be doing better. But by and large, I think it's probably got more staying power than we might give it credit for.
Hi, that's not a bad segue into my question. I was wondering what you thought, or how large a mistake do you think it's been that the multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and their governors, being the US, Europe, and Japan, have not allowed China to have a larger seat at the table, and for their share in those international organizations to reflect their economic global power? And also, what do you think the chances are of them getting larger seats at the table in the near future?
I would call it a mistake, but a small one. And I say a small one for a couple of reasons. First of all, I don't see any sign that China is really that upset about it. I mean, it's the kind of thing they're working on, but they're going to get it. The yuan has now been added to the special drawing right, the SDR, for example. Now, they had to prove that the yuan was largely convertible to do that. Shortly after the IMF said, okay, it's convertible, we're going to add it to the SDR, China brought back capital controls. So, there you have it. But the other thing I'd like to actually talk about here is your question sort of presumes that there are these great international financial institutions. You didn't make this point, but I suspect that you might have been thinking about this. Isn't the U.S. kind of like shooting itself in the foot by turning its back on a lot of them and by being kind of like a bad member? And I think that these institutions have also made mistakes of their own. And I think that among a lot of countries and a lot of governments and a lot of the kinds of people that I interview for my articles, there was almost a presumption that they are intrinsically good and we should do what the World Trade Organization or the IMF tells us to do because they're globalized and they're good and they're technocrats and so forth, and the fact that they're not democratically elected and that a lot of people don't agree with their policies is kind of irrelevant. And so you had what they call in Europe a democratic deficit, a big gap between the rules that were being handed down by these organizations and the sense of justice of the people who had to live by them. To touch on the World Trade Organization briefly, one of the reasons that the United States is being very difficult is that the dispute settlement mechanism had developed a very bad habit of saying, hey, United States, not only do you have to repeal this anti-dumping duty, but your whole anti-dumping duty law is stupid, and we're not going to allow you to impose any more anti-dumping duties like this. And the Americans were saying, now, wait a minute, who made you the global Supreme Court that gets, show me where there's a Madison versus Marbury for, international trade issues. We didn't make you sovereign over us. We said you can decide this one little issue. And so that would be an example of some of these international financial institutions, I think, becoming unaware of the extent to which there was a gap growing between what they did and the legitimacy with which they perceive in their member countries. And so I think it's necessary for the World Bank and the IMF, all these IFIs, to sort of reawaken to that. So David Malpass has just been nominated to run the World Bank. So one of the points he's made in the past is that why in the world does the World Bank still lend money to China? The World Bank is supposed to have a graduation process at which point a country that becomes middle income is no longer eligible for World Bank money. Now, the World Bank does have a particular set of rules under which they say, yeah, no, China's not graduated. They still qualify. But the truth is, the reason the World Bank wants to lend to China is it gives them a seat at the table. They know China is important, and they want China there. They want to have a loan book with China. But it's not necessarily clear why that is good for the mission of the World Bank. That money is much better utilized going to these African countries that we were just talking about a moment ago. So there's a lot, it's kind of a roundabout way of answering your question. I think eventually, China will get a bigger say in these organizations. But to me, that's kind of like second order in terms of the challenges they have to face. I can tell by all the people who are leaving that they're afraid of the pop quiz that's coming, or we're coming up on 7:30. So I think we have time for one more. Is that okay? All right. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for a great talk. Sure. So my question is, despite all the inventiveness of the Chinese entrepreneurs you talked about, the sheer scale of them, the agility of the system to adapt and learn quickly, the education and the skill levels that are, demonstrated by the technocrats, should one continue to remain, or should one remain skeptical of the fact that that system, that combination of factors will still never match up to a dispassionate, efficient, market-based allocation of resources, and therefore that the climb from an $8,000 per capita GDP to a $50,000 per capita GDP won't quite happen at the same pace that it's happened from 1,500 to 8,000.
So yes, the next doubling in GDP per capita will be much harder for China than the last doubling in GDP per capita, which is really not surprising because most countries eventually start to slow down, as I say, once the low-hanging fruit has been plucked. Now you say, will the absence of a more will the presence of this top-down decision-making hold them back? At the margin, yes. If you can think of economic growth as essentially there are many things that affect economic growth, and that is one of them. But also the presence of a lot of a well-educated workforce is very important as well, and China definitely has that. Good infrastructure is one of those things. China has that. And as I said, one of the things that is very different that separates China from, say, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had terrific science and technology and engineering talent, right? It put Sputnik in space, built the H-bomb, and made them competitive with the United States on the military front. But it did not have any appreciation for the value that that talent could generate as part of a market economy. And China does. Now, it could be much bigger and much larger, and I am, as I said, worried that that part is under a lot of pressure as the state-owned enterprises grow. But there was never a time in the Soviet Union's history when you had the kind of competition and the vigor and the competition that Kai-Fu Lee writes about in AI Superpowers. And that's why that even if China does not make as, it doesn't become as market-driven as a lot of us would like to, I still think they have a lot of years of good growth ahead of them, and they will continue to make products and generate new companies that will be impressive and competitive by any stretch of imagination, and we'll see them. And American and Western companies are going to get a run for their money. I think that's about it, right? So thank you very much.